Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is Let's Rant with Scrapper doing Power Wash Simulator. Um, I'm not sure if I've done a rant here. At this point, we've done most of the maps that I like to do, so we may be getting into reruns. But of course, the point of watching these and of me doing them isn't really to play Power Wash Simulator, although hopefully you folks get the same soothing sensation of watching stuff be clean that I do while I'm doing it. It's quite enjoyable. But the purpose, of course, is to rant, to talk about things having to do with role-playing games and MMOs and game design theory and all the rest of it. I wasn't planning to do a rant today. I've actually got to take my car in to get serviced, and I'm going to be kind of busy, so I wasn't actually planning to do a rant today, but I saw a topic that I'm not sure we've talked in great detail enough about, and I would like to just sort of go over it a little bit and discuss kind of my ideas on it and what my thoughts are with this question. So somebody posted a survey to D&D Beyond um, with the options of yes, no, or maybe. And what he said is he's gonna make up a mage, I think a wizard or sorcerer or something. And I guess he wants to do a lot of crowd control, which are save or suck powers or abilities. So, and then he's asking about what the GM has said. So let me define. So this is going to be a rant about fudging, about GMs fudging roles. Um, but to start with, I want to define some things so that if people aren't familiar with specifically D&D and what these things mean, we can understand it in the context of the conversation. Because Dungeons and Dragons isn't the only game that has features like this, although the specific terms may be different in each game. Um, so in Dungeons and Dragons, when a spell is cast upon a target, or when other effects happen, like you stab somebody with a poison needle or whatever, um, the ever since the beginning of the game, the characters who are the targets have the ability to make what's called a saving throw. And this is a roll of the dice where if you roll well enough, usually high enough, you can avoid some or all of the effects of the magical spell. So in with a fireball, right, it does, I think it's 6d8 of damage or something like that in 5th edition. And if you make a successful saving throw, you take half damage. So 68 would average what? Something like 30 damage. um, you would only take 15 if you save. If you fail to save, you take 30. So those kinds of attacks are just differences in amount. But you still usually, there are exceptions, but you still usually take damage from the spell, you just don't take as much. However, there are lots of spells that don't have a numerical effect. There isn't any way to have the effect. And those spells either work or they don't. So, like a paralysis spell like Hold Person, if you try to do Hold Person on somebody, if they succeed, the spell doesn't work at all. It has no effect. If they fail their saving throw, they are locked in place and can't move. Right? Sleep. They fall asleep. Right? And that sort of thing. And these kinds of spells are called save or suck. Because you don't die, right? In the old school days, in original D&D, there were lots of times where you were told you had to make a saving throw or die, right? Poison in old school D&D was generally coded as save or die. And I actually got one of my friend's characters killed when I was playing his character and he was the GM. I've told this story to my best friend. It was a druid. It was the first treasure chest we came to. We had some sort of a rule in our two-person games about, since we were all playing a bunch of different characters, both ours and the GM's, we had some sort of an objective rule about what, like, the turns that people had to take opening chests. So the thief always checked for traps, but the thief wasn't always the one who opened the chest, right? It was sort of, we went, I don't know, in alphabetical order or something, and the druid's name came up first, so the chief thief checked for traps, or the assassin checked for traps, I don't remember which one we had in the party at the time, and failed, like, didn't find anything, right? And then the druid opened the chest and was pricked by a poison needle, and I had to make a save or the druid died. And I failed the save, I rolled too low, the druid died, right? A lot of players hate that mechanic, right? They don't like that a single random roll, I mean, the guy could have 175 hit points. This was a first level character, which is partly why he failed to save, but the character could have 175 hit points. You roll a 1 on that d20, and that character is just going to die instantaneously. There's no vigor roll like there would be in Savage Worlds. You can't spend a Benny, nothing. The character just dies, right? So, because players hated that, and many GMs didn't like using those things against the players because it feels mean, right? And you lose your character forever, and there's no recourse. It's just a random roll, right? As later editions went on, and particularly this is true of 5th edition, they've blunted a lot of the effects. Now, obviously, sleep and hold person just locked you in place and put you to sleep all the time. But even now, poisons, if you fail the save, you're, like, at penalties for a while. Or you might be paralyzed. But the paralysis will end as soon as you successfully save, and you get to remake your save every round, or every minute, or every 10 minutes, or something like that. And so what happens now is you don't save or die, but you say if you don't save, you're in a really bad situation. And so that's called save or suck, right? If you don't save, then it's going to suck for you or for the character, right? So a save or suck spell is a spell that's going to, like, if you fail the save, is going to just basically mean you're out of the battle, essentially. And of course, using it against an evil enemy, like a boss, can kind of wreck the battle in a way. I've talked about this in my City of Heroes plays and so on, how my best friend loved to throw an area effect save or suck spell. Slow. Particularly against Slot Eye, because he knew they had a poor wisdom save, and he could basically make it so that unless they rolled a nat 20, or even if they rolled a nat 20, they couldn't save. Like at one point, because he had the ability to juice his difficulty class of his spells, due to a stupid ability I allowed him to have, he could only do it a certain number of times a day, but when they faced something that he thought wouldn't be able to save, he would just juice it up, you know, to enough that they can't, even a nat 20 won't save it. Like they need a 21 or higher. So I started saying, I'm not even going to roll. These guys can't save, so they fail, right? And it made, I mean, it was save or suck even worse than the normal definition, right? The normal definition of save or suck is if the victim doesn't save, it sucks for him. But this actually made the battles boring, and basically it was save or the battle sucks, right? The gameplay sucks, and like it can be pretty bad. And so, as a GM, you might be tempted to find a way to stop that from happening, because you don't want the battle to be bad or boring. Now, my best friend kept wanting to do it, and the players kept urging him to do it, so I let it happen, right? I thought the battles were boring, but they seemed to like doing it. Like, well, okay, if you're going to do it, if you like doing it, then I'll let you have it, right, as a game master. But not every game master would allow that, and they might try to look for ways to prevent save or suck, minimally, at least to make sure the session doesn't get boring, and also just because some GMs, you know, don't want their villain one-shotted like that, right? I think the main problem is that it becomes boring. If you have a really high, you know, like they give in 5th edition, they dramatically raised the number of hit points that monsters have because they bound the armor class to a manageable level, and the idea is that players like to hit. But that means that there are a lot of hit points, and so if you paralyze something like a dragon, if you manage to hold it, what's going to happen is it's got 200 hit points and it can't do anything, and you guys can only do 15 hit points a shot, maybe 20. It's going to take 10 or 15 hits to take this thing down. Meanwhile, it can't do anything. Right now, yes, dragons get legendary saves, but if we assume that the dragon has already used up his legendary saves, or the GM doesn't think to use it, or I don't know, whatever, or if it's something that doesn't get legendary saves but has hundreds of hit points, like a giant, there's a lot of hit points but no legendary saves, you paralyze somehow a room full of giants, and now you guys are just beating on things to do hit points, right? And it's not very interesting. It's not a challenge, and most GMs are trying to challenge their players. And so a GM is going to want to, it may naturally want, at least early in the battle, for his villains to save against these save or suck spells. So how does this relate to the survey? Well, this player said that his game master told him, or told the group, I guess, that he sometimes fudges rolls. And his question was, is there any point for making up a controlling type of wizard or sorcerer, I can't remember which type of class it was, but a controlling spellcaster who has a lot of these save or suck spells, right? A battlefield controller isn't going to be doing a lot of damage, but they're going to be doing hold person and sleep and slow and hypnotic pattern, which, like, everybody who looks at it is dazed and just stands there looking at it until they make another save. And paralysis, turn to stone, whatever. These are save or suck spells. They don't do any damage, right? If with a fireball, if the monster saves, you still did some damage. Your spell wasn't completely negated most of the time by the save. Now, there are some feats and class abilities where, like, the rogues have an ability to, like, uncanny dodge or something, uncanny escape, I can't remember what they call it, but basically they automatically already take half damage, and if they succeed at the saving throw, they take no damage. But only a few monsters and class abilities and 1 or 2 feats give you the ability to do that, and 99% of the targets in the game aren't going to have that, and therefore, if you throw a damaging spell, if it's a single target spell like Firebolt, there's no save at all. And if it is an AoE type spell, or something like Lightning Bolt or Finger of Death or whatever, you get full damage on the save and on the failed save, and half damage on the successful save. So you at least did something to the enemy. You didn't do nothing, right? And whereas if it's a save or suck spell, and you cast the spell and the enemy saves, it wasted your round, essentially, right? You could talk about legendary saves. Well, monsters could have legendary saves, yes. But if you throw a save or suck spell at a dragon and the GM burns a legendary save, it's like the GM spending a Benny in Savage Worlds to negate what you did. It's a resource, and your attempt at it used up the resource, right? In the Deadlands game I used to watch, where the GM, the players got, in addition to bennies, they got something called Cursed Spanish Gold that worked like a benny, but if they used it, they gave it to the GM, and then he could use it against them. And he had a whole pile of it sometimes. And then he would say, I'm going to use Cursed Spanish Gold to re-roll that, and I'm going to re-roll it again, I'm going to re-roll it again, until because he really wanted to succeed. at whatever this was, like a bigger roll. And the one player, Grov in particular, you would say, good, use those resources. Like, let's make him spend those resources so he doesn't have them later to use them on something worse, right? So, I mean, the obvious strategy against a dragon, if you know it has 3 legendary saves, which once you've faced a dragon, you'll realize that they do, right? The strategy you use against a dragon is you want to throw out the moderate save or suck spells, force the GM to spend legendary saves the first couple of rounds, and then on round 3 or 4, after the legendary saves are gone, then you throw out the big one that you want to really use against the dragon, right? And so that's a tactic, and I think players probably don't mind that because it's a limited resource. But fudging rolls isn't a limited resource. It can happen whenever the GM wants. And so now it's not just, well, he negated your spell but spent a resource. It's he just negated your spell, this dragon, or whatever the monster is, right? And so what this player was saying is, should I bother making up a battlefield controller if I know that the GM is going to fudge? He's admitted he fudges. How do I know he's not going to just negate every cool thing I try to do with my character when I try to control things? And so this is actually an interesting question, and it is a legitimate question. And so I think there's a couple of things. There are a couple of things that are problematic here. Now, I think this is a player who's I think this is a player who hasn't played with this GM before. So one of the problematic things is that this player doesn't feel that he can trust the GM. And when I've talked about fudging before, I've always said that if the GM fudges, it should never be against the players. That doesn't mean you can't fudge rolls that would potentially, go against the wishes of the characters of the party, right? I don't necessarily think it's evil or wrong or bad GMing to make that save when, to say that the save was made when it wasn't, right? If you think it's going to lead to better gameplay, right? Like, I didn't fake the slot saving throws, and I didn't try to do anything to change how the slow spell was going to work or to negate it in any way. But if I had, it wouldn't have been to try and beat the players, right? That's not a good GM, never does that. You're not trying to beat your players. What you're trying to do is provide a good experience. And so if I had done something like made a new color of slot, purple slot, that they had to face, that had high wisdom, and didn't struggle to make this save, right? As I mean, Slot Eye, after all, thematically have magic resistance, so they get advantage on all saving throws. And my best friend's character had a DC that was far higher than it should have been by his entire proficiency bonus, right? He got to add, like, double his proficiency bonus a couple times a day. I don't remember if he had to spend sorcery points or whatever to do it. And so it gave the DC of his saves, instead of like an 18 or something, it gave him like a 22. That's a save DC that the designers of D&D never expected a player fighting Slod to have, right? Because it's not possible to get that high of a save DC at that level, right? The highest proficiency bonus you get, I think, is +6, and the highest stat bonus you can get is plus, I think, 5, right? Under normal circumstances. That's +11 in your base DC before you add those two. The +11 to it is 8. So at 20th level, they only expected the person to have a proficient, like a save of 19 at 20th level. And Slot Eye are DC of 10 or 12, so they figured at 10th level, your save DC would be maybe 16 or 17. And the Slot, with advantage, because they have magic resistance, Now they should have about a 33, 40, 50% chance, about a 30% chance to save. So if there are 3 or 4 slot, a couple of them should save, right? It never occurred to the makers of D&D that somebody would have this high of a save DC as a player character. And so as a GM, I think I would be well within my rights. Well, first of all, to tell him this thing is OP and we're going to change it. But at that point, the campaign was nearing an end and I didn't want to fight about it. I knew it would be a fight, and I was just like, at this point, I just wanted to bring the campaign to a conclusion, and that's enough, right? But additionally, I would have been within my rights to adjust the slot, to make up new slot, to give them new abilities that would at least give them a chance, or possibly even negate this save or suck spell, right? But I would be doing it not to beat the party, but to make the battles more interesting and exciting, because I think slow is making them boring, right? You're doing it as an act of curating the game. We've talked about this before. And so I don't think anybody disputes the GM's right, actually the GM's responsibility, I would say, to curate the game, and that includes determining whether to overrule the dice and fudge, right? But the question isn't, so if you trust your GM to be curating and not trying to beat the party, I don't think, like my best friend, if I had done some fudging with the slot die to make it so that the slow didn't always work, I don't think he would have considered that unfair, right? I think he would recognize that as an act of curating the experience, I had made the determination that this was not a good way to have a battle run, and therefore I am overruling the dice. Now, I didn't do that, but I could have, right? The reality is I always rolled, because I know that what this player is saying is that there's a temptation on the part of the GM, especially if the beginning of a battle or something, there is a temptation to just say that an enemy saved a save or suck spell, right? Nobody, if you roll behind the screen, nobody knows whether you're telling the truth or not, and that you could have rolled high, and you just roll and say, yep, he saved. And how does the player know whether he really saved, quote unquote, or not? Well, I mean, from one perspective, he really saved if the GM said so, right? But I think this player's concern is, well, that can completely negate my my actions, and it could be not the dice that do it, right? That's bad enough, but just the GM just felt like it, right? And so, so this means that the player doesn't trust the GM. Now, the reason for that, I think, is that it's a new player. But I think the other problem is, like, we all know that GMs technically have the power to fudge rolls. That's one of the jobs of the GM, is to overrule the dice when the die results are going to either not make sense or make the session worse, right? I mean, I was talking to somebody in the Sadrill's Discord about Deadlands, and his players are going on this big long journey on horseback, and they're I'm going to stop cleaning this because I feel like it might be annoying to watch that, so we're going to just go upstairs, and we'll just keep cleaning the upstairs. I feel like watching me spin around like that might be, like, give people headaches, so we'll just do the stairs and stuff. He was saying they're going on this journey, and he was asking about the travel rules, and it's just one page in Savage Worlds Core, and there's nothing extra in Deadlands. So I said, well, you could make it a dramatic task, but in the end, what he said was, well, he wants it to kind of be an overland hex crawl. They're going 580 miles across the Weird West, and it should be very dangerous. And so he had used the random adventure generator. It says to check once a day. He figured out how many days the trip would take, and he actually showed me the results of the random draw. You draw cards, and if you get a face card or an ace, a face card or higher they call it, which is basically a face card or an ace. So Jack, King, Queen, Ace. Um, there's a random encounter, and then the suit tells you what type of encounter it is. And it's very common in Savage Worlds to use playing cards that way. And so he had done all 21 days, I think, that he had calculated it was going to take them on horseback. And he had a list of all the results that he'd gotten, and he posted it to the Discord. And so that's cards, not dice, right? But let's imagine, and he had basically an encounter every 3 or 4 days, just by luck. Sometimes it was back to back, and then 8 days would go by with nothing, and that's all fine. It's just random encounters. But let's imagine as a GM, you're doing random encounters, right? And you're pulling cards as they play, right? Or even ahead of time, like this guy did, right? He planned it all out, had it all set ahead of time. And you get face card, face card, face card, face card, face card. And what you decide as the game master, knowing far better your group and knowing the cards don't know what happened on the previous draw, right? They're incapable of knowing that, right? They don't have any intelligence. This isn't an AI, right? It's a deck of cards. And just like the dice, the cards, as Colville has said, don't know what's dramatic or interesting. And you could say as a GM, this is too many encounters, right? That statistically, with that many face cards, right, in a deck, and so many 21 draws, you should get about, let's say, 6 encounters. Instead, you drew like 18. And you could say as a GM, look, this is too many. It's going to become boring and repetitive, right? Or maybe when you draw the encounters, it's just the same. You just, by luck, keep drawing the same suit. Hearts, 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 hearts. You get Ace of Hearts, King of Hearts, Queen of Hearts, Jack of Hearts, all in a row. And it's the same encounter 4 times. That would be boring. So as a GM, you don't do that, right? You say, I'm going to overrule the cards, and I'm going to do something different, because otherwise it's going to be monotonous and boring, and my players are going to hate it. And I'm going to hate it, right? So that's within the purview of the GM to do that at the proper times. And I would argue you should do it, right? I would talk about die rolls in combat, whether somebody hits or not. That's up to you whether you want to fudge that. I don't fudge it, but it's totally up to you, right? I've been rolling completely in the open with my players and drawing cards in the open and everything in my Deadlands game, and it's been fine, right? I actually like doing it. And they seem to like it as well, because they get to see the results, and they can, freak out when the guy aces and that kind of stuff. But the problem is that although we all recognize that it's in the purview of the GM, and that the GM, if they're rolling behind the screen, can be fudging an indefinite number of times. The GM might have fudged every single roll that night and not used the dice at all. It might be a GM who's like, I'm not using dice. I'm going to have happen what I want. But if you tell the players that you're fudging, or that you might fudge, then they don't have any faith in the dice and the results, right? Colville talks about this. What players want to feel like is that what happened in the game is what was fated to happen. And what it artificially feels like is that if you obey the dice, that's fate, right? It's what was supposed to happen, right? But as Colville points out, the dice can't create fate or destiny, right? They just create randomness, right? And fate, by definition, is not random, right? Maybe you agree with Terminator. The Terminator movies, there's no fate but what we make for ourselves. But fate is not, if you think that there's such a thing as fate or destiny, it's not random. So you and I were destined to meet and get married. Well, this isn't a random person then. When somebody says that, they're making a statement that they believe that, a higher power, whether it's the Norns or God or um, whatever, that a higher power matched you to somebody and you were destined to be together, right? It's not a random thing. And so the dice can't really create fate, but it feels like they can. And in any case, it's objective, right? Whatever the dice say is what happens. A lot of players kind of want it to be that way, although the reality is what they're hoping is that the dice will go in their favor, right? Can I do this from the ground? Is this long enough? Yeah, it looks okay. So a lot of players want to go with the dice because they feel like that's fate, right? But if you don't know, if you're playing the game and you don't know whether the dice said it or the GM just said it, if you had a good time, who cares whether the GM is following the dice or not? If you enjoyed the game, what difference does it make, right? So there were certainly times when I ran champions, when I fudged die rolls. It didn't happen much, but it happened occasionally. Nobody ever knew it, right? People had fun in my games. Apparently, fudging didn't harm their fun, right? And that's because they didn't know it, and what happened in the game seemed to be what was supposed to happen in the game. But if you say to the players, I'm going to fudge rolls sometimes, or I fudged that roll, right? Then the players don't have any faith in any of the results, right? And even though you might have fudged everything without telling them and they still had fun, once you tell them that you might fudge or that you sometimes fudge, then it actually harms the fun for a lot of players because they feel like now I have to be at the whim or the mercy of the GM in order to have fun. Now this is an illusory concern because you're always at the whim of the GM in order to have fun. The GM made up the adventure. If you want to have a fun adventure, the GM's got to be able to make up a good one, and if the GM makes up an adventure that's not any fun, then you're not going to have fun, right? So you're kind of always at the mercy of the GM. It's sort of a myth, I guess, to think that you're not. But it feels more like you are when the GM tells you overtly, I fudge sometimes, and therefore what happens is going to be subject to my whims. Right? I mean, that's sort of the unspoken truth anyway, but it's a whole different zebra of a different stripe when the GM tells you I fudge sometimes. Right? Because when the GM doesn't say it, even though we know that the GM can do it, the tendency is to assume he's not. Right? You have the sort of plausible deniability. As soon as the GM says, sometimes I fudge, you lose that plausible deniability, and now we never know if he's fudging or not. Right? It's sort of like my mom once said, she talked about how you have to be very careful with trust, right? That once somebody knows that you lied to them once, right? They never know whether they can believe you or not. How do I know you're not lying to me now? Right? There's even a scene in the Wonder Woman movie, the first one, where Steve Trevor is telling the generals he's not going to go on the mission that he asked them to let him go on. And Diana sort of reprimands him for this afterwards. She says, how can you not do this? How can you not go save these people? And he said, we're going to save them. And she said, you mean you were lying? And he said, I'm a spy. That's what I do. And she said, how do I know you're not lying to me right now? And the only way he could prove he wasn't lying to her, right? Once I know you're a liar, how do I know you're being truthful? The only way he could prove he was being truthful was to pull out the lasso and wrap it around his wrist and say, we're going to go help these people. And then she knew that he was telling the truth, but only because he was wearing a supernatural thing on his arm, right? And fudging is kind of lying, right? You're lying about what the dice said. The dice said hit, and you say miss, right? And it's the same sort of thing. Once I know that the GM, like, it's always, you always know anybody could be lying to you, right? Any person on Earth, when you're having a conversation with them, at any point, could possibly be lying to you. But the only time you worry about whether somebody's lying, other than when you know that what they're saying is untrue for some other reason, because of third party or whatever, is once they've lied, right? When someone has shown themselves to be a liar, then you start worrying whether they're lying to you or not. Until they do that, you usually assume other people are being truthful, right? And it's the same thing with the GM. Until you find out that the GM fudged rolls, you assume they're not, right? And this allows the players to enjoy the game and assume and think that what's happening is what's really happening, right? But as soon as you say, I might fudge, or I fudge sometimes as a GM, right, then the players will always wonder, was that awesome killing blow on the dragon real? Or did the GM just fudge it because he thought it would be cool, but we actually missed and the dragon should have roasted us alive the next round? Right? And even though players want to be cool and want to win, they want to feel like they earned it most of the time, right? They want to feel like they actually earned it. So like if my best friend, after playing in my game and slowing the slot eye over and over again and hearing me say, well, the slot eye can't resist you, looked up the slot and found out they had like +8 to their saves, and realized that every time I let him, and that's not true, they had -1, right? So they couldn't save. And I never fudged it either way, right? For or against them for the saving throws with the slot, right? But if he looked it up and saw that the slot I actually have really good saves, and realized that I was just letting him have the win, he would be very unhappy. In fact, this actually happened to him, right? He wants to be cool. Sometimes he seems to ask to be overpowered, right? And I think the whole thing is he likes superheroes. Despite the fact that he often says he likes the fantasy genre better, the reality is that when he's playing a role-playing game, he wants to play a superhero. And, he wants to be Iron Man, or he wants to be Captain America, or Storm from the X-Men, or Cyclops. Cyclops, I think, was always his favorite character. He wants to be a superhero, right? I think what he really wants is sort of to play champions, but he likes the fantasy genre somehow. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. And so, despite the fact that he sometimes tends to make what I think are overpowered decisions for his characters, I don't think it's from a desire to have an easy time. I think it's from a desire to be cool and superheroic, right? And he still wants somehow to be a superhero, but be challenged. And I don't think, because he hasn't GM'd above 3rd or 4th level in D&D, I just don't think he realizes how very hard it is for a game master to challenge the superhero levels of D&D player characters with the tools and the monsters that they give you in the books. Now, they're in the process of revising D&D, and hopefully they will fix that. But right now, every GM I've ever talked to hates the teen and upper levels because it's impossible to challenge a party. They go from being superheroes to being like, Asgardian gods from Thor, right? That, like, how do you challenge Odin? The only way to challenge him is with Surtur. There's nobody else in the entire Marvel universe, other than maybe Surtur and Thanos, who could challenge Odin, right? And so that becomes problematic in D&D when most of the monsters are not powerful enough to be Surtur, right? And so, so I don't think he really thinks about that. He wants a challenge, but he wants to be a superhero, right? And yes, these are two contradictory ideas, but I just don't think he's thought about it that much. Maybe he has. However, he still wants a challenge, right? So he was telling me that he played this Waterdeep game, and I think I may have mentioned some of this before, but at one point he said, I almost wanted to quit. And I said, what happened? And he said, well, the GM told us he was fudging rolls. Like, he fudged rolls to save our butts in this one battle because we were, like, they were like second level or something, and they were getting their butts handed to them. And so he started fudging rolls and having the enemies miss and do less damage and stuff. And he said, look, I don't mind if he did that, right? That's the GM's job to, decide to do that, and that's fine, but don't tell us, right? Later on, the GM told them, oh yeah, there were supposed to be monsters when you opened the secret door, but I took them out because I didn't think you guys could handle it at that point. And he said, same thing. I don't care if he modifies the adventure on the fly or ahead of time, but don't tell me you're making it easier for me. That it ruins my sense of satisfaction at defeating the challenges, right? It cheapens the result. There's actually an episode of Everybody Loves Raymond, right, where Ray, they have a ping pong table down in the basement, and they're telling this story about how neither Ray nor his brother Robert could ever beat their father at ping pong, because their father was in the Korean War and he learned to play ping pong in Korea from Koreans, and Korea's often their players are often just like sort of chess in Russia, right? They like it's a hobby that a lot of people take up there, and so, or at least used to in the 50s. I don't know if they still do, and so they often won table tennis or ping pong championships and stuff. And so the father was really good, and he would always insult them and upset them. And so this one day, Ray beat his father, right? And it was this legendary day where finally someone beat the dad and everything. And so they're talking about it, and the father goes, yeah, I let you win. And Ray was like, no way. You didn't let me win. And the father's like, yeah, I did. I got tired of you guys crying about it, so I let you win one. And then we never played, and then they never played again, because they figured we don't need to play. We beat him. They played each other, but they never played him again. And he's like, yeah, this way I didn't have to keep, watching you guys sob whenever I beat you, you stupid little kids, right? And so Ray gets mad, right? Because the father now turned that victory into a defeat, right? I didn't actually beat him. And it's this, and then later in the episode, they have a rematch, and the father just crushes him, and Ray says to him, "Now you know how it feels." And the father said, "What do you mean? How it feels when someone lets you win?" And the father's like, "You weren't letting me win." And Ray is like, "Yeah, I was." And the father's like, "Let's play again right now." Right? People don't want to feel like you let them win. And it's the same thing with my best friend and this Waterdeep game, right? He, if you let me win, that's fine, but don't tell me that, right? That it ruins the whole thing. It cheapens the whole experience. It's worse than losing, right? Because losing, you knew you were losing all along, but when you tell somebody afterwards that you let them win, not only do they not get the pleasure of winning, but you take that pleasure away, right? You take what they thought was a happy memory and make it a bad one. That's worse than losing, right? Because that was already the bad memory to begin with, right? So that's why the GM shouldn't say that they're fudging, right? Because it would be like saying to somebody, "Sometimes I let you win when we play table tennis, but not all the time." Well, which times were it? Which times were they when you let me win? Oh, I don't remember, right? And so now you're like, none of those victories seem real. And the same thing happens in a role-playing game if the GM says, well, sometimes I let you guys win, sometimes I fudge. Or worse, says, yeah, that battle you guys won, you only won it because I didn't bring in the reinforcements, right? I did this in the Deadlands game that we were playing, the very first battle, and these guys didn't really know the game yet, and they were fighting two ghouls. Now the ghouls are extras, and the rule in Savage Worlds is you can put up to 3 extras in a battle for each player character. And the ghouls weren't really very tough. But what I didn't, they're melee characters, and what I didn't really notice when I was looking over character sheets is none of the players had fighting except one, right? Only one of the 4, and so that gave them a 2 parry, which meant the ghouls basically couldn't miss. And the ghouls, you know, they have like a poison in their claw, which you have to. It's sort of like a save or suck. If you fail it, I think you take a level of fatigue or something, and so which is bad in Savage Worlds. You don't want fatigue, and so my original formulation, I knew it was the first battle, so I didn't want to put 3 extras, right? Because it was too much. My original formulation was 1 per PC, right? 1 extra per PC. I thought that would be a fairly easy, straightforward battle. And so there were 2, I think I've mentioned this before, there were 2 ghouls that they saw first, and then 2 more were going to come in on the second round. And right away in the first round, one of the characters took 3 wounds. And another character was shaken and wounded right away in the first round. I was like, oh crap. Right? These guys, and the 2 left were kind of the weaker of the 2, the ones who were less good at combat. And I thought, oh man, these guys could die here, right? This could be a TPK. So I just didn't bring in. I said, we'll see what happens. I'm not going to bring in the second set of ghouls yet. And those 2 ghouls were so tough that those my players who I don't think ever considered retreating once in D&D, started backing out of that battle and trying to retreat. And then one of the ghouls got taken down by a summoned monster from the one witch character. And when my best friend saw that, he said, wait a minute, let's stick. And he shot the other ghoul and killed it. And when he realized that they could only take 1 wound, he was like, wait a minute, all we got to do is 1 wound to these guys? Just shake and wound them? Yeah, we can do this. And so they stayed, right? And so they stayed and they won the fight. But it was a tough fight, and they almost ran from this thing. And I never brought in the other ghouls, right? Because it wasn't necessary. The challenge was already high enough. So in a way, I fudged, right? I fudged that encounter. But I didn't say to them, you know, this encounter was 4 ghouls, but the 2 was so hard, I decided not to bring them in. I just didn't say anything, right? And instead of feeling robbed of a victory the way they would if they found out that the battle was, that I was going easy on them, they felt like, hey, this was a really tough fight and we won it, right? Now, since then, their characters are seasoned, they're more experienced, they've run some battles, and when they fought the last battle against a wildcard enemy and 12 cultists, that looked tough too, but man, they survived it. I think nobody ended up wounded. They ran out of bennies, but the session ended, so it doesn't matter if you run out of bennies at the end of the session because you get new ones next session, right? So when we play in a couple of days, they're going to have all their bennies back, right? And that will allow them to continue just fine, and they didn't take any wounds, right? Whereas if they had tried to save their bennies and take the wounds, they would have existing wounds and the bennies would refresh anyway, right? So they've learned Savage Worlds now. They've learned to go ahead and use those bennies to re-roll and get the result you want, especially when you're getting toward the end of a session, right? Because you're going to get new ones next session, and that's part of the tactics of the game. And so I can go harder on them now. And so their enemies were much tougher in the last couple battles, and they did just fine. Nobody's wounded, right? Not even 1 wound. And so now they do have a healer, like their character can heal with a Benny, and so it's one of their background edge abilities, because they were born with a knack. I can't remember what it's called, breach birth. something like that. So, there's that as well. But the point is that they, like, to them, all of the challenges were fun, and they overcame all the challenges just as they were supposed to be. They don't know, and they will never know, that in that first graveyard fight there were supposed to be 4 ghouls. It doesn't matter, right? I just didn't bring in more ghouls. It's fine, right? But it would rob them of their feeling of victory if I told them, oh, I made it easier. So you don't say it. And similarly, as a GM, if you're going to fudge dice, you shouldn't tell people. Again, it is known that GMs can choose not to bring in monsters. It is known that GMs can choose to ignore die rolls. But if you tell people you're doing that, right, then they can't ever trust what happens in the game as being what was going to happen. They'll always think that the GM is artificially either working for or against them. And so, I mean, if you've been with a GM long enough, like my group with me, I'm sure they would say, well, if Scrapper fudges, it's for the good of the group and the good of the game, and, like, it's always been fun, so if he's fudging, who cares, right? We don't need to know, and it doesn't matter because we have fun anyway, right? Because they've been with me for a couple of years now, and we've had lots of fun together. But when it's a new GM, you don't know if it's going to be fun, and you don't know if you can trust their fudging. So what you want to do is believe that they're just going with what it says in the module and going, or in their notes, and going with what the die rolls say, and, like, what you don't know won't hurt you, but when you know it, it can ruin the fun. So I think this player's main problem is that the GM told them I might fudge sometimes, right? If the GM just didn't say that, this player wouldn't have this concern, right? He would know that GMs sometimes fudge, but, like, I think the other implication is when you say it, you do it more often than when you don't. Like, I don't know if it's true, but I think that GM, like, the assumption I think that a lot of people would make is that because all GMs sometimes fudge, a GM who says I fudge rolls sometimes must do it a lot more than other GMs would, right? Whereas other GMs are more like me. You might fudge once or twice in an entire campaign, right? I fudged exactly twice in my 55 session Rome campaign. Die rolls. Now, I did certainly on the fly change encounter difficulties and stuff, and add or subtract monsters. I did that a few times, not many. Almost always it was, this fight's too easy, I'm going to add some monsters to it, right? Or I'll add monsters to the next fight because this has just been lame. And that's something that's in the purview of the GM, and everybody would expect that. But again, it only happened a few times, right? So whether it's correct or not, but I suspect it is, I think the assumption that people make is, since every GM can fudge, the ones who say they fudge are saying it because they do it a lot, right? Several times a session, maybe. And that, I would say, is too much, right? You shouldn't be fudging that much. Something's wrong if you're fudging that much. Either the players aren't picking up on your clues and hints, or you're not scaling the battles correctly, or the module didn't scale the battles correctly, or you're not running the monsters right, or something. Because nobody should be required to fudge that much, right? There are just sometimes sessions where the players can't, on D20, roll above a 6. Or in Savage Worlds, they just can't roll a 4 or higher. No matter whether they're rolling D10s or D4s. They just can't ace, right? I had this actually happen to my bad guys. And I was sort of like, this is one where I might have fudged, just because it became statistically ridiculous. There were 10 cultists, and after the main bad guy died, I said I'm going to make a morale check. I'm going to give them spirit rolls to see if they stick or try to run. And these guys only had D4 and Spirit. And they were minions, extras, so they didn't have a wild die. So they had to roll a 4 on D4. But statistically, 2 or 3 of them, 25% of them, at least should have stuck. And all 10 of them failed. I even made the comment at one point, wow, you'd think at least one of these D4s would come up a 4, like when I was on the 7th or 8th one and everybody sort of laughed. Right? I was rolling in the open, so they know I wasn't just... And if I was going to just fudge it, I would have said, okay, they all... What I should have done was made a group morale check. I didn't have any bennies, so I couldn't re-roll it, but at least it just took so long to make that many morale checks. That was a big mistake. I shouldn't have done that. I should have just said, I'm going to make a group morale check for them. Because they outnumber you, I'm going to give them a +2. And then just roll it and see what happens. And if they stay, we continue the fight. And if they fail, they run, right, as a group, instead of doing them one at a time. That was a big mistake on my part. But that's just because it became tedious, right? So that's where, if I were rolling behind the screen individually, I might... so it was getting late. So this is one of the cases where if I had done a group morale behind the screen, I might have just said, okay, they all fail and they start to run. Right? But if you don't think about it getting late, and we just think about, like, the individual morale checks, at some point, we need a City of Heroes streak breaker. Right? There's no way that 10 D4 should never come up with a single 4. But it didn't. I kept rolling 1s, 2s, and 3s. So... if I'd been rolling behind the screen, the last 1 or 2, I might have said, oh, finally somebody got a 4, right? Just so that a couple of them stayed behind. But that's the only kind of fudging I might do, right? Just because sometimes the randomness is so ridiculous that you're like, okay, this isn't believable almost anymore. But again, if I fudged it, I wouldn't tell them I fudged it. Right? I would just do it. And I think that that's the problem. This player, his concern is if he's going to do all of these save or suck spells, right, that the GM could literally negate everything he does if the GM just feels like it shouldn't happen. Right? And again, if it was legendary saves, well, those are a resource. If you're going to spend them on this spell, you can't spend them on the next one, right? Or if the GM is rolling in front of the screen and it negates, at least you know the GM isn't arbitrarily negating my spells. And because the player doesn't know the GM, he simply doesn't know if this GM is going to be the sort of GM who's going to arbitrarily negate his spells. So I think the GM made a big mistake by saying to them, I fudge. Right? Because now you can see the effect it's having on one player, and I'm sure other players are thinking the same thing. Right? Is my rogue ever going to be able to sneak anywhere? Or is the GM always going to just say that the enemy sees him or hears him? Right? There's no way to know if the GM is admittedly fudging rolls. And since it's a new GM to this guy, he doesn't know if he can trust the GM to sort of fudge in a fair way. Hopefully that's what the GM will do, but there's just no way to know. Right? By the way, this is why I started in when the characters were 4th or 5th level, 4th level, and they were fighting a UNT necromancer, and my best friend wanted to hold person. Now it turns out, I've told this story before, hold person shouldn't work on UNT because they're not humanoid, they're monstrosities. But neither he nor I realized that. So if this UNT boss had failed, his necromancer had failed his saving throw, I would have had the hold person work. Okay. because I thought it was supposed to. I was incorrect about that, but I thought it was supposed to. He also had at least one, I think it was one legendary save, maybe two, I can't remember. He was legendary. He's the first legendary monster they faced. He had at least one legendary save. So if I didn't want the whole person to work, I could have. I had already knew as soon as he said I'm going to do a whole person. I was like, all right, I'm going to use his legendary save on that. Now I'm pretty sure because he was a low-level enemy, he only had one legendary save. But I was pretty confident that my best friend, once he saw that the guy had legendary saves, wouldn't fish to see how many of them he has. He just would have stopped, right? But I didn't want to burn the legendary save if I didn't need to. And he had a pretty good save. Like, he had pretty good bonuses against whatever this was. I guess wisdom. And so I thought, oh, there's a pretty good chance he can save, but I didn't, like, because it was save or suck, right? And I knew, again, if you think about what this player's talking about, on round one, somebody tries to hold person the boss monster, it would be very tempting for most GMs to just hand wave that away and say it doesn't work, right? I rolled high enough. So what I decided to do, because I had the legendary save in the bank and I knew I could use it, what I decided to do was roll that saving throw in the open, right? I said, okay, what's the DC? 14. All right, here's his roll. Boom, rolled like a 17 right in front of everybody. And they're all like, ah, right? So now my best friend knew, I'm not negating your ability with a DM decision, right? I rolled this guy's save. Now, he had a good wisdom because he was like an evil, he wasn't a necromancer, he was like an evil cleric. And clerics have high wisdom. So he had like plus, and I think he was proficient. So he had like +4, +5. So he only had to roll like a 10 in order to save, right? So it was like a 50-50 chance. And you could say, well, you know, in a way, I DM negated him by giving the guy really good saving throw, right? For that level. For 4th level, he had very nice saving throw. But what the players care about isn't the bonus that the enemy has. They care about the roll, right? +6, they don't care about. But if you roll a 1 and say, ah, he saved anyway, yeah, they don't, that bothers them, right? So I rolled it in the open, and he succeeded. So then, again, because I didn't realize hold person shouldn't work, and I didn't warn my best friend about this, he said, I'm going to try it again, right? He had like 3 spell, level 2, I think it's his level 2 spell slots at that point, I think, or maybe he could use sorcery points to get a spell slot back. I think that's what happened. I'm going to use my sorcery points and try it again. And again, I rolled in the open. And the guy rolled like another 16 or a 17. Like, he didn't even need the bonuses in this particular case. I just kept rolling high in the virtual tabletop. And the die roll appears right in front of them. And they could see they didn't even need to look at the total in the chat box. They could see the die, the 3-dimensional die roll on the screen and come up with like an 18. Like, ah, he succeeded again. Right? And then my friend tried it a 3rd time. And a 3rd time I rolled like an 18 or something really high. And my best friend was like, you've got to be kidding me with these rolls. Right? But it's the virtual tabletop, right? I wasn't doing anything. I was rolling in the open. And this taught them that I'm not trying to have this guy succeed just because I want to. I'm rolling the dice. Now again, one of the reasons I was free to roll the dice is I knew I had a legendary save in the can, and if he had failed the roll, I was going to, use legendary save and say, well, okay, he's going to use his legendary save to choose to succeed where he failed, right? But I never had to do that, and so he always succeeded at the roll all 3 times. Okay? And after doing that, I decided I liked doing that so much because it proved that the save was legit, as it were. That from then on, until the end of the campaign. Although I usually made 2 hit and damage rolls with my own dice, mostly because I just like rolling my own dice. I spent a lot of money on my metal dice when I was going to be a player, because the original DM, like, he hadn't used VTTs. He had only used like Zoom, and they rolled real dice in his group. And so he said, "Oh, you're going to roll real dice, and we're just going to use D&D Beyond to like keep track of the character sheets." At the time, there was no die rolling in D&D Beyond. That was much more recent, right? It was just a character sheet repository at the time, back in like 2019. And he said, "No, you're going to roll real dice." So I said, because I said, "Should I buy dice?" He said, "Yeah, buy dice. You're going to be rolling real dice." So I went out and bought expensive, awesome dice. I bought some plastic ones, and I didn't like them, and so I got this really nice metal die set from, I actually can't remember the name of the company. I should say it because I like them, but I can't remember the name of the company. Anyway, I bought these dice. I bought a wormwood dice tray. I spent a couple $100 on my dice and dice tray. I want to use them. So as a game master, right, I just rolled my dice because I wanted to roll my dice. Not because I was trying to keep anything secret from the players. And I'd still like to roll my own dice. But in Savage Worlds, I've been rolling in the open. But for saving throws, especially for savers suck, right? Like if it's damage, like Fireball, I didn't care as much. But for but I think I always did those in the open too. But for the saver suck spells, right? I always rolled in the open so that they knew I was never negating their spells with DM fiat, right? And that's what this player is worried about, right? That I'm going to use up a whole entire turn of my character's actions when I could like shoot a crossbow and do some damage, or throw a cantrip like Firebolt and do some guaranteed damage if I roll high enough to hit. And instead I'm casting Sleep or Hold Person or Hypnotic Pattern, and the GM is just making the spell completely useless because every time I throw it, he just says, "Ah, they saved," right? And I don't know whether they're really saving or whether he's just using DM fiat to negate my abilities. Right? And so that's why you don't want to tell people that you fudge if you do as a GM, because then they can't trust any of it, and they always will be concerned about whether the DM's fiat is negating their abilities. Now, again, a lot of this is illusory, right? Because as I said, I could have made up, there are red, green, blue, gray, and death slot, but there are rumors of black and white slot, but there are no stats for them. So I could have made up black and white slot. I could have made up purple slot and orange slot and pink slot and polka dot slot, and I could have given them +10 to their wisdom save. And would that really be any different from me just waving my hand and say these slot are not affected? No. But to players, it feels different, right? Even though it isn't any different. Like mechanically, what happens is those slot are going to, with advantage and +10, they're going to save, right? Or I could make slot that are immune to magic spells, right? Just immune to what is it? Enchantment spells, right? And these slot are immune. It's in their stat block. I don't know if players would like that either, right? Because again, it feels like the GM is trying to negate what you're doing, right? Players don't mind if a die roll negates what they did, but they don't like it if the DM just says no, especially if it's something it says they can do on their character sheet, right? So, I mean, it's sort of like mind control in Champions, right? GMs hated it because it could mess up a whole battle and it was a pain in the neck, right? In order to get it to work, you had to get, in the old days, like triple or quadruple and in modern days, plus 20 or plus 30, I think, of their ego, of the target's ego. So, anybody you didn't want to have mind controlled, you gave good ego defense. But giving ego defense, or mental defense as they call it now, is different from just saying, oh, they're not affected by mind control. Right? Because if the guy has 10 or 15 points of ego defense, technically the mentalist could still roll really, really high on the mind control, right? And they could still potentially, maybe, cause the villain to at least have to stop what he's doing. Even if he doesn't, like, join the heroes, he might stop fighting them for a few minutes, for a couple phases. If even it's just a phase, right, that affects the combat, oftentimes the mentalist is satisfied. Okay, for 1 or 2 phases, I took this villain out of the battle, right? And that enabled my group to win, or help them win, right? And so it's not that they necessarily want to paralyze you for the whole battle, or turn you against your comrades for the whole battle, but for 1 or 2 phases, right? And so, so yeah, you have to be very careful with doing this sort of thing, and you have to be careful with telling the players. Again, it's the GM's job to curate the experience, and so you're supposed to be doing this thing, right? This is the problem. As a GM, you're supposed to fudge sometimes. You're supposed to change villain weaknesses and stuff, do things that make the game more fun, challenging, and engaging for the players. But if the players feel like you're arbitrarily doing things to prevent them from doing what they want to do, and to prevent their characters from doing cool stuff, then they get frustrated, and they don't like it, and they don't trust the story you're telling, right? Then it starts to feel like a railroad. Then it starts to feel like you're doing what you want instead of helping the players have a good time. And that's never how you want it to feel. So the easiest and best way to handle this is to not do what this GM did, right? That is to say, if you want to fudge, fudge, but don't tell people you're fudging. And don't do what the guy who GM'd my best friend in his Waterdeep game did. Don't say after a tough fight, oh, I made that fight easier because I was afraid you guys were all going to TPK. Don't say that to them. Just let them have the win, right? And you know you curated it. That's fine. That's your job. They know you're curating stuff in the abstract, but you don't tell them that any particular thing was curated. And you should never say, oh, well, I sometimes make battles easier or fudge rolls, right? Because then they're never going to be able to know when you're doing it. And then they feel like you're not trusting them to be good players and to be able to overcome your challenges, right? And so, if you're going to fudge, do it privately, do it secretly. Don't tell the players you're doing it. Don't even leave that as an option, right? If they ever ask you, do you ever fudge, you can say, well, you'd have to peek behind my screen to find that out, right? Then they don't know, right? A GM never tells, like a magician never tells his tricks, right? A GM never tells whether he fudges or not, or she, right? So don't ever say it. Don't tell them you fudge. Be coy about it. If they ask you point blank, do you fudge? Just, be coy about it. Don't tell them that you fudge, because then what happened with this player can happen, and you can end up having a lack of trust. We'll leave it there, and until next time, guys, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been Scrapperlock Rants Power Wash Simulator.